I'm really trying to accomplish two things right now. Number one, I'm trying to sit with my back straight without tilting to the left, which is very hard. And number two, I'm trying not to go insane, because this is my fifth attempt at shooting this video. The previous four have been unsuccessful for a variety of technical issues, which is why I think that the universe knows that it threw a couple of really curved balls at me bookwise by the end of 2025, and it doesn't want me to talk about them. However, dear universe, I do not care what your plans are. My plans are to discuss all those bad books that you made me read last year, and the good ones too, and the mediocre ones. And since the total amount of the books that I've read in 2025 amounts the amount amounts of 10 new fiction works in English, which is fantastic because I'm not sure I've been able to accomplish even half of that in 2024, mostly because I've been moving around from country to country and I had to negotiate my suitcase space, which unfortunately is very limited, which means that I could not take any physical books with me. And since I am a physical book girly, a book girly through and through, I cannot do with this whole screen nonsense, PDFs and ebooks. No, not for me. I get distracted just like that. All of this means that I suffered in 2024 and I did not read almost at all, which is very non characteristic for me. But now that I'm finally settled in a place where I hope I'll be able to live peacefully for at least a couple of years, although the universe is in a crazy place right now, but a girl can hope. I have been pillaging the local bookstores, and I have acquired quite a cute pile, of which half I've read already in 2025 at the end of it, and the other half I have reserved for my 2026 TBR. And today we're going to focus on everything that I've read and completed in English in 2025. Without further ado, actually, please allow me to hold your attention for just a little bit of further ado. Look at him. Just look at him. Isn't he beautiful? Isn't he lovely? His name is Broccoli, and my girlfriend made him for me. From scratch. He was part of my Christmas present, and I adore him. He lives rent free in my room, in my heart, and in this video. He's gonna sit here with us, behave, and he shall join us for this lovely, lively, and hopefully entertaining discussion. Let's go. I know you love a good rant review. So do I. Those spicy roast. I gave it 1 star, and this is why. I read this book so you wouldn't have to videos. I am a connoisseur of such content, okay? I am the ultimate lover of a good deep dive into something that made the reviewer angry, which is why I'm gonna place me being angry at the end of this video. We're gonna start with the best of the best, the creme de la creme, the absolute masterpieces that have carved their place on the shelf of my forever beloved books, and then we're going to slowly descend into sadness, boredom, and mediocrity. We shall start with the highest note ever, with the masterpiece of the masterpieces, a book that, despite me hating to read from my screen, I've read on the screen of my phone in an ebook format, while my life was being at its most chaotic, the peak of chaos, and nothing happening around me in the real world, or any of those thousands of notifications that popped on my screen every minute, nothing could have distracted me from the masterpiece that is Between Two Fires by Christopher Buhlman. How do I explain what Between Two Fires is, aside from the fact that it's glorious? It's a story about Thomas, a 14th century French nobleman turned knight turned brigand, as in bandit, who travels across plague-ridden France with a little girl, his companion. Her name I shall not tell you because the narrative reveals her name somewhere around the middle of the book, and although it doesn't influence the plot per se, it is such a beautiful, touching moment that I would never dream of robbing you of it. Those two and a drunken priest with a golden heart travel through all sorts of dangers, both physical and psychological and emotional and demonic, to the city of Avignon, because the girl has prophetic visions. Angels tell her that a huge showdown, a final battle between the forces of good and evil, will take place in the city of Avignon soon, basically the apocalypse, and she has to be there. Said forces of evil learn very soon that the girl is going to where the final showdown will be, and they are not happy about that. They do everything that stands in their power to stop her pilgrimage. Whether they are successful in that endeavor or not, you will find out when reading Between Two Fires. I will not spoil it, obviously. But before you decide to join Thomas and the little girl and the priest in their shenanigans, do look up the trigger warning list. it's extensive. This book is about as bleak and dark and bloody as a story set in an era when the entirety of Europe was very sure that the end of the world was upon them could possibly be. However, despite the gloominess and the darkness and the dirt, the literal dirt that the characters are coated in for at least half of the narrative, I think that this is one of the most uplifting and beautiful testaments to the unbeatable human desire to live, to this need that we carry inside ourselves to find something worth fighting for and worth dying for. That, at the same time, paradoxically, is exactly the thing that keeps us alive the longest. This is a story about a found family, people coming from very different backgrounds, forming very unlikely bonds that end up being stronger than blood. A dynamic that is very similar to Arya Stark and the Hound traveling through Westeros, except that this one is 10 times better. This is people fighting some of the most ingenious and original depictions of demonic manifestations that I have encountered in recent fantasy. This is someone's past, someone's sins, someone's crimes catching up with them in real time, influencing the decisions that they are able to do on their way to salvation and redemption. Between Two Fires in general is a story about redemption and forgiveness and the things that we are able to do to prove to ourselves that we are still human. This is an exploration of these two fundamental pillars that the human soul rests upon: fear and the desire to do good. When you talk about books that you've loved, you're supposed to start by going through the highlights, the things that you loved most, but Between Two Fires was entirely made of highlights for me. I loved the characters, the dynamics between the characters, the three dimensionality of them, the fact that the author respects you as a reader and his characters enough to make them real in the sense that he doesn't shy away from equipping his characters with terrible flaws, crimes in their past that are not there just to make the character look edgy. The consequences of the actions of the characters end up coming back and biting them in the ass. When I say search up the trigger warnings, I'm not joking. The stakes are very high and they do not seem artificially inflated. As a reader, you fully believe that at any given moment throughout the entire narrative, your favorite characters that you root for, sometimes despite your best judgment, could possibly die. These are fictional people, you've known them for 2 days, and you really worry about them the way you'd worry about deeply loved friends. I've mentioned it, but I shall repeat myself. The found family trope is probably the pearl in the beautiful tiara that this story is, the diamond, really. When you reread the novel, you feel like a weight has been lifted off your shoulders because now you know how it ends, and you don't have to focus all of your reader's energy into praying to all things good and just in this world, that the author doesn't kill the characters by the end of each consecutive chapter. You know where the tragedy of the book lies, you know where the relief of the book lies, and you have more attention basically to spare towards those small details that add to the general realism of the story. I can feel that Billman really loved and respected the story and the characters. And I thank him profoundly for having created something that moved me so deeply and I know will continue moving me for years to come, which is the point of no return after which we no longer could possibly be forgiven. Which is the crime that makes a person into something evil, if there even is such a crime? Or is it an amalgamation of small little acts that, taken separately, they mean nothing much, but mixed up together, they create a monster where a human once was? Ladies and gentlemen, this was Between Two Fires for you. Absolutely go read it if you can stomach a darker kind of story, if you're a lover of all things medieval and Catholic and fantasy, and if you're ready to cry a lot, but also laugh a lot and feel an immense sense of relief and basically go through an emotional catharsis, then this is the book for you. And we are moving on. The second book on this list is probably my most subjective entry in the entire ranking system, which is funny because obviously the entire video is very much my subjective opinion on books. But it was a story that was so endearing, so warm, and so dear to me that it ended up being the only book that I physically took with me from Vietnam, where I used to live before. The mere thought that I possess this book now, that it's present in my house, and that I can grab it up and reread it at any given point in time, makes me happy. And the book is Solomon's Crown by Natasha Siegel. We are not yet leaving medieval France, still stuck here, but this time in the 12th century. This is first and furthermost a love story. Obviously, historical fiction, yes, but a love story. So, despite the story featuring military conflicts and intrigues at court, betrayals, all sorts of hierarchies in the ruling class of France, all those things serve as a beautiful, skillfully done backdrop for the main focus, which is the relationship between Philip, young King of France, and Richard Lionheart. Yeah, the Richard Lionheart, the one that we all know from history. They are actual historical figures who have existed, but as far as we know, they've never entertained a romantic relationship in the real world. So one could say that this is a piece of fan fiction on historical people, and I don't mind that at all. I've seen a couple of reviews have an issue with that. Like, if you're creating this entirely made up relationship between real people, why not just use fictional princes? Why not make up your own countries? But I love fanfiction, and it's very much clear that Natasha Siegel likes this particular historical period. And if she wants to pretend and to imagine what would have happened if those two were in love, why not? So, as you might have guessed, this is indeed a love story between Philip and Richard. They have both inherited quite an unpleasant inheritance from their respective fathers. Richard is still a prince, so obviously we know he will become the King of England eventually, but in this story, he's still a prince. Philip is the young king of France, a France that has been at war with England for decades. They have been constantly conquering and reconquering territories, losing people and resources. Everyone is very tired, everyone is very weary. No one wants to continue this war, but things are, as always, not as easy as the characters wish they were. Throughout the entire narrative, Philip and Richard understand that war is an impending doom that is hanging above their heads, while at the same time they start, to their horror, or at the very least to Philip's horror, they start developing romantic feelings for each other. Philip is shy and reserved. He's not necessarily self-loathing. Thank God, at the very least, this story does not contain any self loathing, but he's definitely self doubting. He has issues with accepting himself, with his affections, with the way he looks at men, which makes perfect sense because this is 12th century Europe, deeply Catholic, and while concessions were made for kings, certainly not for kings who were in love with other kings. Whatever he lacks in physical health, he certainly makes up in intellectual capabilities. He is a great ruler from the perspective of his strategist, but unfortunately, the circumstances in which he lives demand for a ruler who is also talented at the battlefield. Richard, on the other hand, is huge and strong and brawly. All he wants to do is fight, drink, fight again, and have escapades with various lovers of various genders. When Philip has issues with accepting his identity, Richard has no issues at all, and Richard yearns. For the entirety of the book, Richard yearns in the most anguishing, the most delicious way ever. While the characters think that their relationship is doomed and there's not a chance for them to obtain any kind of happiness, and soon enough they might encounter each other on the battlefield while not being on the same side, you, as the reader, are given to understand from the very first chapters that the author roots for the characters about as much as you do, if not more so, which implies that the ending will probably be satisfactory for this particular relationship that we all, both us and the author, observe with so much tenderness. Because indeed, the relationship between Richard and Philip is based on tenderness and respect. And although they do not believe in a common future, in a happy future, the way they treat each other with so much care and so much attention and so much acknowledgement of each other's boundaries and desires is honestly beautiful. It is very rare, especially in queer fiction, that I see a relationship that stays so far away from the exhausting trope of miscommunications. Richard and Philip do not miscommunicate. They certainly have their own reservations. They are young and mostly unexperienced. They find challenging to talk, especially Philip, who is not used to open up at all. Richard has a lovely relationship with his mother. Mommy issues galore, but a functional relationship. Philip has never had the chance to build a close connection, a proximity to someone. The whole notion of intimate friendship is very new to him. Even friendship is new, let alone a romantic pursuit. There is constant banter in there, so much chemistry. Richard flirts the way a tank advances across a battlefield. nothing can stop him. When he sees Philip, when he hears Philip, when he thinks about Philip, no force in the universe, Catholic or otherwise, English or French, human or divine, could possibly stop Richard from going after what he wants. The intrigue was intriguing, the politic was politicking. I would say that the ending, the non relationship conflict, the military conflict, was resolved a little bit in a kind of deus ex machina way, but for the purposes of this story, considering that the main focus is on them, on Richard and Philip, I'll allow that, and I have no issues with the particular way in which Natasha Siegel has decided to wrap up the political strife between France and England. Obviously, this is very far from the historical succession of events, but I think she kept true to the spirit of the era, to the atmosphere that permeated both England and France at the time. And considering that this was meant to be a light-hearted, optimistic, beautiful, young, sweet love story, the background was solid and believable and never once made me roll my eyes, which is rare in historical romance novels, especially set in the Middle Ages. Although the relationship between Philip and Richard is obviously the jewel of the book, we also have marvelous depictions of familial bonds, daddy issues, of all possible flavors, unlikely reluctant friendships that both of them explore. For Richard, it's a complex relationship with his siblings. For Philip, it's a beautiful budding friendship with his young wife. None of them wanted the marriage, it was a purely political union, obviously, but there's so much tenderness, again, in their friendship that buds from the very first wedding night that never happened, which honestly just serves to characterize Philip as a person. He himself is very tender. He's full with respect to all things alive that surround him. It is very refreshing to encounter two young male characters who are valorous and courageous and brave and masculine, but also wholesome and healthy and untoxic. This is a beautiful depiction of a very young, sincere, vulnerable, and respectful love. And this was exactly what I needed in moments of anxiety and turmoil in my own life. And if that's what you're looking for right now, if you want a little bit of balm on your soul, if you want the fuzzy, warm feeling of wrapping yourself in a warm blanket and listening to your grandma's tales, then I highly recommend Solomon's Crown. May this type of love find us all, honestly. Book number 3 on this list was a complete accident. It would have never even ended up being on my TBR had it not been for Rachel from Reads with Rachel, who has filmed a beautiful review of the book that has immediately piqued my interest. And then when I saw it in the bookstore, without a second thought, I bought it. And I loved it. And the book is The Gilded Crown by Marianne Gordon. I absolutely beseech you to go watch Rachel's review. I'm sure that she has done a much better job at this than me because she's way more experienced. She has a great non-spoilery section at the beginning of the video, so if you end up deciding that you want to continue with getting to know the book and actually reading it, you don't have to worry about being spoiled. And then she has a in-depth exploration of each aspect of the plot and the journey of the characters, obviously spoilery. So if you are like me and spoilers do not bother you a lot when you already are interested in a narrative, then just go watch the entire video. It's great anyways. The Gilded Crown is a fantasy set in a secondary world, which means that it's a world that's different from ours, and it's the story of a girl named Helliver. When she falls asleep, she travels to this buffer area between life and death, basically kind of purgatory, but not necessarily, more like an entry hall to death, where she finds this personification of death, a man who rules things in that domain. And she discovers at a young age that she can trade back the souls of those recently deceased, both animals and humans, for a price. It's not cheap for Helliver. It takes a toll on her, and the more she does it, the bigger the toll. The local royal family of the country where Helliver lives finds out about this ability of hers because she resurrects the royal granddaughter, the heiress to the throne, who has been poisoned, as far as I remember. Well, she was murdered, basically, assassinated. Helliver brings her back to life, and then the queen of the country, this young princess's grandmother, summons Helliver to the capital of the city to be her granddaughter's on-call resurrectionist, basically. Should anyone ever attempt another assassination and be successful, Helliver will be there to bring Sullivan, the princess, back from the dead. The transaction is costly. She literally chops pieces of her own soul in order to do that. So Death, in his infinite mercy, offers her a deal. There are certain objects in the real world where Heliver lives that hold special meaning for Death, this incarnation. Magical artifacts, one might say, and Death tells her that she can retrieve those magical artifacts. He gives her riddles that she should solve and then understand what the riddle is about and where the place is that she should travel to get that magical artifact that she can eventually trade for the soul of Sullivan, should she potentially be killed again, or any other human that Heliver might be interested in bringing back from the dead. So now this young girl is in the capital where she has to navigate at the same time settling in the capital. She's been living in a village her entire life. So, boom, big city, lots of people, lots of things to do, a very new environment. Being part of royal intrigue and trying to uncover who is the culprit, who was the person who ordered Sullivan's assassination, navigating a difficult relationship with her family members, not an abusive one, not a toxic one, just a complex relationship with her father, her stepmother, and her younger brother. While at the same time, she understands that she starts catching feelings for the princess, and the feeling is apparently reciprocated. Is this a romantasy? No, absolutely not. This is an adventure fantasy. It features a quest, actually multiple quests. It features an investigation of the princess's assassination. It features complex relationships between characters, each of whom hides more than one secret in their closet. The world itself is beautifully crafted. There's an old religion and a new religion, and they clash, and obviously consequences happen for all of the characters involved. There's a very rich mythological background that makes you believe that this world has existed way before you've opened the book and way before Haliver was born into it. I absolutely adore it when authors manage to craft universes that feel ancient, that feel filled with history, events that happened and then led to other events happening. So, your natural course of history, the same way we have it here in our world, that have an intricate, complex mythological system, and not just one, but multiple, especially if the world is big. And Marianne Gordon has populated her world with very particular, very unique mythological creatures, fantasy creatures that I have never seen in any other contemporary fantasy or older fantasy. There is a particular quest that Halivers goes to that has been offered to her by Death to retrieve yet another magical object that is so unique and so the world building top notch, 10 out of 10. Great. Certain questions that are crucial to the plot, that constitute the plot, were asked in this book that have not yet found an answer because we will have eventual installments of the series, a second volume, maybe a third one, who knows. My absolute favorite elements of the book were my neighbors are doing some crazy stuff and it's like 2 a.m. They should be sleeping by now. Mythological background, world building, and also crafting meaningful relationships between Heliver and her closest ones, her dearest ones. Not just the princess, by the way. You might have noticed that I avoid the topic of her relationship with the princess because I want you to go in blind into the narrative when it comes to their relationship. I want you to not know anything about how the story of those two progresses. I want you to have the pleasure of discovering it on your own. But when it comes to Haliver's relationships with the other people who surround her, her family, her brother, her stepmother, those were also done in a way that defies your typical cliches of this particular kind of relationships that unfortunately I encounter in a lot of contemporary fantasy. For some reason, a lot of authors have decided to resort to those cliches. And I am very grateful that Marianne Gordon has stayed away from them. Overall, great read. I've enjoyed it a lot. I have certain small nitpickings about the particular aspects of the investigation that was going on in the palace on who murdered the princess, who the culprit is, how did they get to understand who the culprit is, like the logical, the investigative process itself left me with some questions unanswered. But overall, compared to the satisfaction that I've received from seeing Heliver journeying this world, learning things about life and death and herself and the past of the world and how that past has maybe been rewritten and reshaped by the current ruling party, compared to the pleasure of having read all of that, my nitpicking is honestly unsubstantial. This is a very me subjective thing that I don't even want to go into much detail about because I don't think that that would influence your experience with having read this book. Overall, it was a great pleasure, and I sincerely hope that you will be as pleasantly surprised with the Gilded Crown as I was. Go watch Rachel's review. She is much better than me at explaining how good the book is. Moving on. We are entering a very controversial territory here because we're going to talk about Heir of Kwang and Catabasis. I have a very rocky relationship with Heir of Kwang and her books. I do think that she is a very good and skilled writer in the sense that her craft, the prose itself, obviously has been given a lot of time, a lot of work and effort from her over the years that she's been writing, and probably for many years before that. Professionally writing, I mean, obviously she's been writing since she was a child, and that is evident. I struggle with the tone of her books sometimes. I do not like feeling as if the book believes me to be more stupid and more morally bankrupt than the book's main characters. And least of all, I've appreciated that in Babel. I DNF'd Babel at 30%, and I could never look at that book again. Even though I did enjoy her other two things, as in the series, the fantasy series, the Poppy Wars, really enjoyed that one. I to this day think that that's her best work. And Yellow Face 2 was a delight. I read it on a plane, and for 11 hours I could not unstick my eyes from the page. I've heard people say that Catabasis is worse than Babel, and that made me very scared and very apprehensive before actually diving into the story, because I thought that it would double down on the sensation that the narrative, not the author, the narrative considers you to be stupid. But controversial, hot take? I think that it's not the case, and let me explain why. So, for those of you who do not know, Catabasis is a story of Alice and Peter who descend into hell. They are postgraduate students at Cambridge. They are writing their PhDs, or at the very least, Alice is, and they are descending into hell to bring back the soul of a professor who has died and who, in Alice's opinion, is the only one in the entire world who could help her with the PhD, review her PhD, recommend her to some of his colleagues, and basically propel her career. Alice is very academically driven. Her entire life is academia, so for her, it's a question of life and death, literally. The entire book is basically her shenanigans with Peter in hell, the quests that they go through, the difficulties that they encounter, and ways in which they overcome them or not. I'm not gonna spoil anything to you. People and creatures and concepts that they encounter while down there, and also a ton of flashbacks that shape the characters and help us get an understanding of who they are, why their relationship is the way it is, how did it come to be this way, what is it that they truly want, and what is it that they run away from. Morning. This is 4 a.m. editing freshly out of shower alley here. And first of all, I've learned to properly use my microphone so I don't need to hold it in my hand anymore. And second of all, I've been going through the section of the wrap up where I talk about catabasis, and I've realized that although it's the longest section of the video, it's also the least informative one. I was so afraid of spoiling stuff because this is a relatively fresh release that I've been meandering a lot, and I've ended up not saying anything substantial about the plot, the characters, or the main issue that a lot of readers seem to have with the book. And here I am trying to rectify that. The most important thought that I'd love to convey when talking about catabasis is that it has been terribly mismarketed. It's been advertised as one thing when in reality is something very different. My main point of interest, the reason why I picked the book up, was the fact that it's a story set in the underworld about people descending into hell and, I don't know, going through all sorts of adventures while down there. It was not. It did not feature as much hell as a book with such a premise should have, which made me irritated and almost made me DNF it at around 25%. Other people have picked up catabasis because they were promised in advertisements in enemies to lovers kind of tropey love story. And again, it was unfortunately not. They were never really enemies. This is really not about going to hell. This is really not about a meticulously crafted universe that would have been Kwong's version of hell. This is not about the relationship between the main characters, and it's not even about the world of academia per se. This is about Alice Law, the main character, a plethora of traumas and biases and ugly things that have happened to her, not only at Cambridge, but also before that, that have constructed her into the person that we end up seeing on page. This is the story of Alice mustering the courage to exit the armor of unhealthy coping mechanisms, trauma responses, bad habits and an abysmal self-esteem that she has wrapped herself into. This is her learning that certain things have value in life and what those things really are, and how to discern between things that really are valuable for her and things that she hysterically holds on to because she doesn't really know what she is without those things, and she is animalistically afraid of looking at herself outside of the context of those things that she thinks define her as a person. I would have had a much better time with those first 30% that have frustrated the hell out of me, because I would have known that Hal and Peter and all the mythology and all the mathematics, the Cambridge itself, all of those are a beautiful and intricate framework that exists to make Alice the star of the show. I do believe that this is very autobiographical, that Alice is absolutely a self-insert, although she's a self-insert done right, and that it has been a very cathartic process for Araf Kwong. I think that she has done her healing, and here in Catabasis, she allows Alice Law to get to a form of healing that might or might not be similar to Rebecca's healing. So I advise you to go into Catabasis knowing that this entire everything basically that constitutes this book is a beautiful backdrop. It's a show that is created solely for Alice to be the star of it. And then, if you're okay with that, if that sounds like something that you'd be interested in reading, then you will have a much better time with it than you might have had you only been guided by the synopsis, the way the book was presented in the advertisement, and what Kwong herself had to say about it during her interviews. Okay, done. Back to the wrap up. Is Catabasis a good book? I do not know. Did I enjoy reading it? More so yes than no. I certainly had a grand time with the last 40% of the book. Against my best judgment and against my most sincere efforts to not like the characters, I ended up rooting for them and I ended up feeling a great deal of sympathy for them, especially for Alice. Peter was a sweetheart, and I enjoyed having him on page a lot, and reading about him was a pleasure. But I hold a grand grudge against Peter because he was the cause, and I will stand on this ground. He was the cause of the biggest miscommunication in this book that has shifted the relationship between Alice and Peter. It's in the flashback section. So before they actually go to hell, before we encounter them in the beginning of the book, their relationship has suffered, the friendship, let's call it that, because it's not a romantic relationship yet. It has suffered a transformation. I'm trying to be as vague as possible because of a miscommunication for which Peter is to blame. He failed to communicate a very simple thing that could have been presented in a very plausible manner that could have saved them both the embarrassment without getting into personal details, without having to open his soul in front of Alice if he didn't want to. But Alice is the main reason why I can say with my full chest that I did indeed enjoy Catabasis. I've also encountered this idea in some of the reviews that I've read and watched that allegedly Kwong's knows that her readers would have to stop reading the book, put it down sometimes, and then go do a shameful Google search to learn about things that the book presents to you as if they were universally known, very basic truths. And allegedly, Kwong derives some sort of pleasure from knowing that her readers would sometimes feel intellectually inferior to her. And I think that that's not the case. You don't need to do prerequisite reading to understand Catabasis, the story itself, the plot itself. Obviously, when two professionals who are at a PhD level talk in a professional environment about something that they are both passionate about, that they've spent years researching, they will use phrases and notions that you, the general reader, would not understand. More so considering that their field of study is a made up one. It's not real. Analytical magic does not exist. When you watch a movie about doctors or plumbers or zookeepers and they have a professional conversation, when they don't even finish their sentences, they understand each other mid phrase because of the experience that they have. Are you expected to follow the conversation and distinguish between the theories that they throw at each other, between the names that are very well known across the industry, but only across the industry, that they casually used in their conversations? I don't think so. No one expects you to read an anatomy atlas before watching Doctor House, and I do not think that Kwong expects her readers to go read the entire Divine Comedy before starting Catabasis. And those bits of knowledge that are actually crucial for you to understand why the story progresses the way it progresses, those things are explained not only in dialogue between the characters, but also in those info dumping sections that people complain about. You read them and you have a perfectly clear understanding of what is going on. You do not need to do all that extra reading. You might, of course, if you find that their conversations spark your interest for certain actual real world disciplines. Of course, you are more than welcome to go and deepen your research, broaden your horizons, learn new stuff. That's always very welcomed. But you don't need to do that. And I don't think that the book punishes you for not knowing those things. I really struggle to see how else would the whole scope and grandeur and those years of very serious research that has been done in this field of analytical magic, how else would it have been presented to you, the reader, in a way that would make you understand the scale that this field, this discipline takes in Alice's and Peter's lives. It is by no means a flawless book. It is pretentious as hell. I've heard people who go to Cambridge, who have gone to Cambridge, say that this is a very inaccurate description of what your proper Cambridge postgrad routine would look like. But overall, I think that this was a very brave experiment by Kwong in the sense that she has clearly explored a lot of her own healing process. I think that the relationship between the main characters, although I would have definitely preferred more depth and more development, was very tender. I certainly believe that considering the circumstances that their lives have been at constant danger in hell, the fact that they have evolved some sort of intense feelings for each other over a short period of time is very much believable. Trauma bonding is real, especially for people who have had some sort of history. If a book has managed to make me really care for a character that I really dislike as a person, I think that that book has done its job. I think that it has merit. It was not wasted time, and I think that Kwong is clearly in love with academia as a whole. She has a very love hate kind of relationship with it. It's always a pleasure to see an author be in their space. While at times I wish an editor would have reined her in a little bit, I am happy that she gets to write about things that very evidently are her passion and spark her up. Let's move on. What do you call a book that is way better than mediocre, but also somewhat not good enough to be really memorable? And you feel that you'd be ready to recommend it, but you really struggle with picturing the perfect person who you would recommend it to. This is yet again, who's surprised, a medieval Catholic fantasy. Except that this time, instead of France, we travel to 15th century Italy, Florence to be specific. When I was 16, I read Agate in Ecstasy, and my life has never been the same to the point that I've chosen my major, art history, in part because of the influence that that book has had on my young, impressionable mind. When I hear to this day such words as Michelangelo, or Florence, or the Renaissance, or Medici, I feel a kind of shiver in my heart, which is why my encounter with this book on the shelves of the bookstore has inevitably led to a purchase. Because not only does it take place during Renaissance Florence, Medici Florence, but also because the main character of this story is a guy who normally features in books written about this particular era as a very negative character. Guess who has not mentioned the name of the book or the author in this entire ranting session? It's Land by Joe Walton. Have you ever heard about Girolamo Savonarola? I doubt, because he's not an artist and not a sculptor and not a writer of the Renaissance. Rather, he was a priest, a very vocal one who did not like the Medici and a bunch of drunk, unpious, satanic, lustful sinners that lived in his house, by which I mean the whole gang of painters and sculptors that he was the patron of. Savonarola had a lot to say on behalf of those people, and the vanity and the sinfulness that they and their art and their interest in all things pagan and ancient and carnal and worldly brought onto the good Christians of Florence. We're talking about burning paintings and books, anything that Savonarola would deem worldly and vain. But this book focuses on him. It's literally written from his perspective. We are in his POV all the time. And while I cannot necessarily say that he's a good person, in the context of Land, he's definitely a very interesting personality to observe. In Land, Savonarola is, as he historically was, a priest, but he's also an exorcist. Here, demons and angels and all sorts of supernatural things exist, and he is very good and very known for his ability to exorcise demons out of people. And the story starts with him doing so, with a young nun at a convent, and then, after having successfully performed said exorcism, having found a special magical artifact in the library of the convent. And then all hell breaks loose, literally and figuratively. His life does a complete 180. He gets tangled in political intrigue. There's great tension between him and the most powerful people of the church of the time. And he draws the attention of certain powerful hell personalities, let's call them that. He also learns things that make him question everything that he ever believed to be true about himself and the world in which he lives. This is a slow kind of story that builds up without haste, and it leans much more so towards historical fiction than fantasy, which is a good thing for me because, again, I love that era. I know things about those people. This was definitely a perspective that I have not yet encountered, which is why I was very interested in getting to know this Savonarola that was quite different from the usual representation in media and from the actual historical portrait of the guy that we have. And I found him, in Joe Walton's interpretation, to be a very endearing man for whom I had a great deal of empathy. He explores friendships and rivalry and hopes, and again, the question of forgiveness and redemption and exploration, and this eternal battle that we as humanity seem to never be able to either win or lose, which is the battle between what we are instinctively, biologically, and who we choose to be in the sense of people and actions and decisions that we make in our lives. What outweighs basically nature or nurture? Although, of course, Savonarola in his 15th century does not think in such terms. For him, it's a question of free will, sinfulness, someone's inherent nature, and the great gift that we all humans have, which is the possibility to make decisions. And of course, to bear consequences. We have people being burned at the stake here, and we have people being persecuted and hunted down for their religious and political views. I guess that it just seems way more colorful and life inspiring. First of all, because no one dies of plague. As far as I remember, I've read it in January. I guess that plague might have been mentioned because it was present in Italy at the time, but just not to the extent to which the Black Death has literally scraped Europe clean in the 14th century. And also because a big an important part of the narrative is the Renaissance in and of itself. All of those wonderful new, brilliant colors, forms, shapes, thoughts, melodies. There's a lot of art. There's a lot of beautiful, flourishing Florence, which is a tautologist. Florence is in and of itself inherently flourishing. There's a lot of religious, theological reflections, but again, just as Between Two Fires didn't try to convert you into Catholicism, I feel that Lent isn't trying to do that either. It just presents you this worldview that the people of the era upheld based on their beliefs, and you can either vibe with it or not. I am only saying this because I was raised in a very religious household, not Catholic, but Christian, and I have been given books as a child, as a teenager, that kind of sounded fantasy and were supposed to be written by lay people for lay people, but there was this underlying message in there that either you believe the way the author of the book thinks that is the right way to believe, or there's something wrong with you. You should do better. I am very apprehensive when reading books that center on religion, especially Christianity, specifically because I know that they have a tendency to do that, and I am grateful to both Joe Walton and Christopher Buhlman for not doing that. For a review that centers around land, I surely do talk about Between Two Fires a lot, but this is merely because those two stories are both set in the Middle Ages in Europe, so there's a lot of overlap and intersection in them, and also because Catholic imagery and Catholic demonology plays a big part in both of those stories, so obviously the comparison is inescapable. Is there any hope at the end of the tunnel? Is there any chance to do better when you have consistently been not doing better for a long period of time? Is there any chance for us humans to break the vicious cycle of habits that make us commit crimes and do things that are bad for ourselves and people around us? I did feel that the narrative dragged a little bit sometimes, just a little bit. It was slower than I would prefer it to be. It's a good book, especially if you love Florence, if you love the Renaissance, if the word Medici rings a bell in your mind, if you enjoy Catholicism as an art form, if I may say so. If you enjoy the history of the Catholic Church and you're interested in looking at how the people of that age view their own place in the cosmology of the world around them, I guess you would enjoy Land. I certainly did enjoy it. I would simply hope that there was a little bit more action packed into it. It sounds shallow and superficial, as if deep psychological and spiritual reflections would not be enough to satisfy me, but I think that for the purposes of this particular story, where we do have a narrative, a mysterious investigation, even, it's a kind of the Groundhog Day kind of story. And that kind of story calls for tension and for intrigue because otherwise it becomes repetitive and boring. And I'm not saying that Land is boring, I'm just saying that it's slow. If you are interested in everything that I've been venting about for the past 15 minutes, I'll do a lot of trimming for this section of the video for sure. If that sounds like something that you would be curious in learning more about, do go into this book knowing that sometimes you would have to breathe slower and take your time, your sweet, sweet time with the narrative. But all in all, it was very much enjoyable. And we are moving on. When Haru Was Here by Dustin Tao, it would be very hard for me to talk about this book because this is the kind of story that relies massively upon you, the reader, not having been spoiled the middle and the end. And because I cannot go through the plot points that either made sense or did not make sense to me particularly, and I have major questions towards some of the plot points, I will focus more so on the characters and the dynamics between them and the overall impression that I had from the story. When Haru Was Here is a story about Eric, a young boy who lives in Chicago, and he has a crush on his best friend. Then they go to Japan. It's their senior year in high school. They are just about to graduate, and a big world opens in front of them. Eric meets this guy named Haru. His best friend knows that Eric has a crush on him, but they kind of never talk about this, and this whole relationship is starting to be very difficult to navigate for young Eric. He's somewhat in between being a friend and being a boyfriend, and it's very unclear and it's tedious. So he meets this guy Haru, and there's an instant attraction, and then they part ways without having managed to exchange numbers or any other contact information. And then Eric's best friend slash crush dies. This is not a spoiler because it happens right at the beginning of the book. It's also mentioned in the synopsis. And this whole story is Eric's attempts at dealing with the grief of the sudden and unexpected death of the guy that he loved, had a crush on, loved. At such a young age, I think that there's no difference between being in love with someone and having a crush. And then after his best friend has died, Eric starts seeing this guy Haru in Chicago. They talk. Haru tells him that he's traveled to Chicago specifically because he remembers Eric waxing poetically about it. And oh my gosh, what a lucky coincidence, we've met again, just the same way we've met in Tokyo. The problem is that no one else seems to be able to see Haru or interact with him or hear him. So Eric asks himself, is this real or is this my own coping mechanism of dealing with the trauma of having lost the person that I loved? Let's go quickly about the things that I loved about the book and then unfortunately dive into the massive questions that I have regarding the characters and the plot. I loved Eric's relationship with his sister. I thought it was very tender and very, very believable. I have a younger brother myself, and I have recognized patterns and situations and behaviors and even dialogues that were present in my life when my brother was a teenager, especially a younger teenager. I also think that the whole concept of a young boy having suffered intense emotional trauma, while at the same time being thrust into the adult world, this period of transition from boyhood into adulthood, the confusion, the sadness, the grief that comes with it, because you're kind of grieving your childhood, even if you don't understand it while you are in the process. As an adult, you're looking back and you understand now, having had this life experience, that the sadness that you felt in that transitionary period was a sadness of loss. However, the book is trying to convince you that its main question, the mystery, is whether Haru was indeed here or not, whether he's real or whether he's a hallucination or rather a coping mechanism, because the brain cannot comprehend what's going on in his life and the brain cannot manage this whole giant unexpected loss. Spoiler, minor spoiler, I suppose. However, is it really a spoiler if 30% into the book we already know with a sure conviction that Haru is not real? It is a image, it's a persona that Eric has created that he resorts to when he feels most overwhelmed and loneliest. Eric understands it himself, and while understanding it, at the same time he doesn't really want to acknowledge it, which is also relatable sometimes, especially when we're young. There are very difficult truths that we do not want to digest, while at the same time, we are very much fully aware of the fact that those truths exist. We just don't want them to. We don't want to face them, but we know that they are hidden there somewhere in the back of our minds. And when we have enough resource, then we're able to finally face them and then take action. So I don't necessarily have an issue with Eric jumping back and forth from, oh, I know Haru is not real, but what if he is? But what if he's not? But what if he is? But considering the context of the story, it is very clear that it is just Eric's vivid imagination combined with grief and trauma. I think obviously healing is not a linear process, and you have drawbacks and you have periods of stagnation, but not as fast and not as ping ponging as Eric did, in my opinion. I'm not obviously a certified psychologist, I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist at all, but that felt unrealistic. And the second thing that pissed me off, unfortunately, was Eric himself, or rather the fact that through the entirety of the book, Eric seemed incapable of making a single decision. I understand that when you're young and your high school has just ended, you don't know what you want to do, you didn't get into college, everyone else is moving on and you're not. I understand that it's very hard to exist in these circumstances. You need mental capacity and mental strength to craft a new personality, to discover yourself anew. And obviously, when your brain is exhausted by constant grief and constant self doubt, it doesn't have the resource to do that. I understand that. But our life is made of small everyday decisions that we make even when we are at our lowest. And Eric seems to be incapable of making such decisions. The god and his machine is omnipresent in this story. Things happen to Eric, people bump into Eric, circumstances seem to either work in his favor without him having to do anything, or they don't work in his favor, but then the negative outcome of any situation that Eric might fail in for some reason ends up being to his advantage at the end. The inertia is strong with that one. I don't think it's bad to write about a character who struggles with decision making, because a lot of people would identify and would relate with that a lot. But Eric's incapability of taking any decision seems more like a flaw of the narrative and of the author's choices rather than a conscious decision to create such a character. I must say, I did not anticipate the ending. My girlfriend, to whom I was venting about the book through the entire process of me having read it, she said, well, yeah, I saw it coming from the very beginning, but I've noticed that you were unaware of what's coming and I didn't want to spoil the intrigue for you. So for some people, I guess the ending might be very obvious from the very first couple of chapters, but to me, the big reveal I thought was going to be not what it ended up being. What the fuck was that? It sounded as if my neighbors were letting an elephant run in the room. It was genuinely scary right now. Anyway, as I was saying, what was I saying? I guess that final twist, the final highlight, and Eric's relationship with his sister, those things exist separately, were my favorite parts of the experience of having read when Haru was here. I could possibly potentially recommend it for those of you who are seeking a teenager coming of age kind of story, those of you who do not mind a main character who has no idea who he is as a character, not as a person. If you're looking for the artistic scene of Chicago, music, literature, cinema, if you enjoy mind games, if you're okay with them not being necessarily entirely realistic, then I could potentially recommend this book to you, especially if you're a younger teenager or an older teenager. And if you yourself are struggling with the notion of grief and loss of identity at a young age, by all means, give it a try. You might have a much better time with it than I did. But if you, like me, read the synopsis and you wanted to keep second guessing through the entire narrative whether Haru was real or not, if you were there for that intrigue particularly, I would not recommend it to my friends. I would not recommend it to people whose literary tastes I know, but I'm sure that there is a demographic out there who would have a much better time with Haru than I did. Moving on. And we are plummeting and plummeting and plummeting to the bottom of the well, unfortunately. Let's talk about Atalanta by Jennifer Saint. I do not know what else to say about this book that I have not said in my 1 hour and a half long review of it. My incapability to hold my strong emotions about this book for myself, my urge to share them with the world, was actually the reason why I've created this channel to begin with. So probably I believe that I have to thank Jennifer Saint for having created this book, because otherwise I would have never mustered enough courage and motivation to actually go with the idea of a booktube channel that I was always so interested in. Atalanta is actually a character from Greek mythology. We have two different myths about her that do not overlap except in the name of the main character. And what Jennifer Saint did is she connected those myths, she tied them together, and I must admit that she did that rather seamlessly. The plot flows through those two storylines in a way that makes perfect sense for the character and for the world in which she lives. The scenery is beautiful. There's a lot of ancient Greek idyllic nature. There's this nautical adventure that they embark on. There are characters from the Greek mythology present in there, names that you know and love, especially if you've been a Greek myth fan, just like me, since elementary school. And here lies my main issue with Atalanta. Jennifer Saint is a very smart woman. She knows that Greek mythology is in vogue now. She knows that a lot of us have had a deep personal relationship with those stories since we were kids. So, what she did, unfortunately, was she took a lot of names, a lot of people from Greek myths, such figures that you might recognize as Heracles and Hades and Orpheus and so on and so on. And what she did is she basically peppered her books with those names, putting a little bit of Medea and Heracles here, a little bit of Orpheus and Aethys here, and a beautiful shining Artemis on top. And this is the unfortunate case of the author knowing that the readers know these characters, their stories, their backgrounds. The author doesn't take their sweet time to actually incorporate the stories and the backgrounds into the narrative that they're building. So instead of using the fact that you, the reader, are already familiar with Orpheus and the tragedy of his love, instead of using the space of the book to create meaningful connections and dialogues between Orpheus and other Argonauts, that would help you discover this character from new perspectives that were unexplored in the original myth, the author limits herself at merely mentioning him and telling us time and time again that he sings pretty and that he is good at playing his lyre. We know that. It is indeed very convenient to feature characters whose backgrounds don't need to be explained to you, dear reader, because you are already familiar with them from your class on Greek mythology that you took as your high school elective. But is that necessarily efficient writing? I am not so sure. The second thing that pissed me off about Atalanta was the fact that there was no continuity within the main character herself. What I mean by that is that when you have a character who has lived her entire life in a very particular environment with a very particular set of rules, she has literally been in a cult and she was happy being part of that cult. She loves her goddess more than anything in the world. Her entire scope, her entire purpose of embarking on this adventure, the main plot of the book, is Atalanta and the Argonauts going on the Argo, as in the ship, to a distant land to retrieve a certain artifact that would bring glory to the respective gods who have placed those heroes, those Argonauts, on that ship as their personal champions. So Atalanta's purpose is to participate in that adventure and partake in the spoils, and thus to bring glory to Artemis, the goddess whom she adores more than anyone else in the world. Her existence is dedicated to making Artemis proud. Mild spoilers, I guess, but again, this is a piece of mythology that's been around for 5,000 years. Artemis's followers are not allowed to have intercourse with men. It is preferable that they do not interact with men at all, but certainly not sexually, and Atalanta knows this. She has seen other characters, other nymphs, get in trouble with Artemis and being betrayed and being hurt and let down by the men who they have had intercourse with, willingly or unwillingly. Atalanta knows that nothing but confusion and heartbreak and complications come from being with men, and she knows that this is literally the only law that Artemis has set in stone, that she, as her devoted follower, has been adhering to her entire life. Atalanta acts, in the book, in ways that to me seem to be abrasively, rudely against what she has been taught her entire life. This is all that I'm going to be saying about the book for the purposes of this video. If you want to hear me rant more about Atalanta and be very butthurt and disappointed and confused, but also give praise where praise is due and highlight the moments of the narrative that made me emotional and that were well worth the time invested in reading the novel, you are more than welcome to go watch the respective video. But of course, only after we've done with this wrap up, of which we have just a little bit left. Let's go on. The next to last book on our list is Definition of Go Girl, Give Us Nothing, and it is Gallant by V.E. Schwab. This is a book that is entirely made of beautiful vibes, and when I say beautiful, I mean it. We have a haunted house, a family that has been plagued by a curse that ends up in the death of many of the family members. So we have a main character that has, I am not sure I've identified the diagnosis the right way, so do correct me if you've read Gallant and you think that I'm wrong, but I think what she has is selective mutism in the sense that she has been through a very traumatic event as a child, and after that, she kind of lost her ability to speak. Not in the sense that she physically couldn't, but there was this block in her psyche that would not let her talk. We have a character with a traumatic past that obviously is linked to this dark, creepy mansion. She lives in an orphanage and then she receives a letter from said creepy mansion from which she learns that she still has some distant family members alive, and they invite her to live at the house. The house is called Gallant. Gallant is the name of the house. She travels there, and then all sorts of supernatural, dangerous, dark stuff happens to her. The image is vivid and beautiful. Schwab is very good with her language. We all know that. She is masterful when it comes to crafting a visually beautiful, satisfying picture. Unfortunately, what Gallant is a Tumblr post, a scroll through someone's Pinterest board with all things aesthetic, gothic, and dark. It's an image of a house that has a twin house, a dark, shadowy thing that exists kind of at the same time, and they intertwine like that. And the concept of those houses intertwining and them being so similar, and dark things lurking in the dark version of the house, creaking corridors, shadowy men who have a grudge against the living members of the family that owns the house that the main character ends up being part of. That's a beautiful concept, a very intriguing and interesting concept. And I feel that V. Schwab was very much enamored with this idea of twin houses that kind of coexist as a single organism, and she ended up having this wonderful concept that indeed looks like a concept, like concept art for a game when you don't yet have the plot, you do not know the characters, but you have this beautiful vision board. And unfortunately, it ended at that. This book is an ode to Schwab's wonderful imagination when it comes to depicting the house. So even in the best of the stories where the locus where the story takes place is its own separate character, the space frames the narrative. As beautiful and cinematic and as irreplaceable as a well-crafted backdrop is for certain type of stories, it's still a backdrop. We have other elements of a book that make a concept into a finished novel. Characters, plot, motivation, reasons, all sorts of things, a narrative, some pacing, things happening. And Gallant is so packed with vibes that unfortunately Schwab, for some reason, kind of hesitated to enrich those vibes with an actual functioning story. The characters are very flat, two dimensional, they have no motivation. Most of them are just walking labels that end up being props and tools for the main character. It is a bad sign when the plot of your story has more holes than a road in a village in Moldova. I could have not told you, for the love of me, what the ending of the book was. Closure is non existent, the ending is forced upon the characters and the reader. The chemistry has left the chat and the characters. I remember nothing from that book aside from the fact that I was really intrigued by the concept of the house. And I really wanted to learn more about the history of the family. How did they manage to almost go extinct? What is this thing that's haunting them? Why is it haunting them? I couldn't tell you anything about the characters from Gallant because I don't know anything about them. Blank slate. If you're looking for a late October Halloweenish kind of gothic haunted manor kind of vibe, there are better books out there who do this while also respecting you enough to give you a believable, plausible, well-crafted cast of characters at the very least. Some of them also throw in a good mystical intrigue in there, and I'm gonna mention such a book by the end of this very video. So yes, I placed Gallant on its unspectacular next to last place, and we are moving on, finally, to the worst sinner, the worst disappointment of 2025. Ladies and gentlemen, the worst of the worst, the bottom of the barrel, the book that I have had very high expectations for. I was genuinely curious to read it. I went in with a very open heart, and I've been let down so harshly. Reading this book was about as entertaining and as fulfilling as finding out that the cast of your favorite TV show comes to your hometown, spending a shit ton of money on booking a meet and greet with your favorite actor, then standing about 2 hours under freezing cold, icy rain in a line, and then being told at the entrance to the venue that the actor has cancelled the meet and greet, and then maybe you will be refunded in the next couple of months. Maybe. I feel really let down by Amal Rio's The Graveyard Shift. I have loved If We Were Villains, and so many other creators whose bookish tastes align perfectly with mine have also loved If We Were Villains. I've read their reviews, I know our opinions coincide, and then those very people have had so much criticism to spare on the behalf of The Graveyard Shift. So, what in the world has possessed me to believe that I'd be able to enjoy it regardless? I do not know. In a perfect world where this book would have been given enough time and care and respect from the author and the publishing team, would have been able to summarize this story by saying that this is a book about five people who meet randomly at an abandoned cemetery sometimes at night to smoke and converse. And then one night they find a freshly dug hole in the ground. And since the cemetery is abandoned, people are no longer interred there. So where does the hole come from? They decide to investigate this, and their investigation leads them to an altercation with a big pharma company with a research facility that does some very shady stuff in their hometown that some of them have personal connections to and personal beef with. And all of this is also spiced up with mushrooms and mycelia and the way spores affect the human mind, and also hallucinations caused by insomnia. This sensation of being unable to go to sleep, but also being unable to bear the world because of how sleep deprived you are. And that book would have ended in some sort of plausible way. But unfortunately, we do not live in a perfect world. And in ours, what we have instead of that novel that would have surely been magnificent is this. This is not a novella. This is the concept of a novel that was trimmed down to 120 pages of nonsense. Whose idea was it to fit 5 POVs in 120 pages? I really want to know. Do you know what else has 5 POVs? Six of Crows. Do you know how thick Six of Crows is? 5 times thicker than this, which means that each respective character has been given 5 times more screen time in order for you, the reader, to be able to bond with them. This is a classic example of the author thinking that they have so much page space left and then making this very long and tedious introduction and then realizing that they need to fit the entire rest of the story in 50 pages. The characters have no motivation. They say that they do, but in reality they do not. Their thoughts, their past, their present, their actions, their jobs, nothing about them influences any of the decisions that they make and any of the consequences that their decisions have. In fact, there are no consequences at all. Questions are being asked in the first chapter, building up to something that promises to be an intriguing and interesting narrative, if not a believable portrait of a person suffering from insomnia. Because I don't know how you could do that 5 different distinct times in the span of 120 pages, then at the very least, a mysterious investigation. But those questions are never answered. And it seems as if the author doesn't even think that they have to be answered. Everything that is significant to the plot happens off page. We are told in a meaningless, passive dialogue between two characters who have no reason to be in the space where they are that certain things have happened. And I would have really loved to see those things happen because they are kind of the reason why this narrative exists. The 5 main POVs could have easily been cut down to 2 because only 2 of these 5 people actually do something important for the plot, and the rest of them are there merely for decoration. There's a journalist in this group of 5 people, a person whose job consists in interviewing people, writing articles, working in communications. She knows the ins and outs of the profession. And then at a certain point, the guys decide to take an interview of the alleged second in command of the big, bad, mad scientist of the story. And they don't send the journalist to do that. They send a character who has no background, no studies, and no experience in that kind of work. Why? We don't know. Was the journalist sick? Was she unavailable? Did she just simply not want to go and do that? We do not know. It is not explained to us in a way that makes sense. Characters ignore each other for 80% of the narrative, and then in the end, I'm supposed to believe that they have a meaningful friendship or a love situationship going on? When did they manage to do that? Off page? where the main plot has happened. It really could have been a good story. It had the makings of the good story. But I think I can take a wild guess at what happened here. Emil Rio has released If We Were Villains many years ago, and although this is still a very well respected and well beloved book, I am sure that her publisher approached her and told her, "Hey, Emil Rio, you have a big new release scheduled for September of 2025. Meanwhile, we would really love you to come up with some sort of idea that we could quickly pack into a novella and just send into the world so that we put you back on the radar, so that people talk about you again, so that it will be easier for us to build momentum to this big release of yours that is scheduled for September." And I do not know why Emil Rio took an idea that I am sure has been with her for quite some time, and she has decided to sacrifice it basically in the name of marketing her upcoming novel, which, by the way, features in here too. This was supposed to be really deep and interesting, and it ended up feeling as if this entire joke of a novella was just a poorly scripted ad for this. A shame. If, however, you are still in the mood for dark gothic mansions, creepy, eerie stuff happening, mushrooms being involved and influencing animals and people alike, biological bodies behaving in ways in which they should not behave, mysteries hanging above old families that might or might not have been cursed, then I present to you What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. I really want to end this video on a cheerful note. I've read this immediately after I was done with the Graveyard Shift. I knew exactly what I was doing. I knew that this is based on a very similar premise. I knew that it explored similar aspects and topics. And before you come for me and tell me that T. Kingfisher had it easier than Emil Rio because this is based on an existing work, which is the Fall of the House of Usher, I beg you to go reread The Fall of the House of Usher and notice that it's about 10 pages long, 5 of which are illustrations. This has introduced characters and background and reason and explanations to something that was a very effective but super short story, the intention of which was to scare you because of the uncanny effect, not to explain anything at all. And T. Kingfisher provided ample explanations. Here we have a very charming, very sincere main character that is a pleasure to observe. A character who understands what the word friendship means and what sort of obligations being a friend imposes upon someone. Here we have tender, touching relationships that lasted for years and that, despite not being updated for several decades, still hold a lot of importance for the people involved in them. Here you have an actually interesting mystery, just the right amount for it to be true to the good old gothic genre. Here you have a plausible explanation for whatever is going on in this house, whatever is wrong with these people, that might not necessarily make perfect sense for someone who is a biologist or a mycologist, but in the context of the story and the world that T. Kingfisher has crafted, indeed answers all the questions that you as a reader might have posed while reading the book. There's continuity. The backgrounds of the characters deeply influence the way they view the world and the situation in which they found themselves, how they act, what they say, what they think, and what the outcomes of their actions are. This is short, creepy, on point, and perfect for a late November night when you want the chills, but also the comfort. I would say that it's cozy fantasy, but there's a couple of scenes in there that I would really struggle to call cozy. If you want to be slightly creeped out, not too much, just slightly, and more so enticed by the gothic atmosphere, this is your choice. This is really good. This is my first acquaintance with T. Kingfisher's works. I've been eyeing her books for a while, but I could never find them in bookstores, and I prefer to start a relationship with an author's work by reading their physical works. Unless, of course, we're talking about Between Two Fires that completely broke that rule of mine. Now that I found several of her books in a bookstore in my area, you will surely be seeing more of her in upcoming videos. Ladies and gentlemen, this was it. We are done. This time we've defied the technical issues and maybe the universe itself. Thank you so much for sticking around. Let me know if you've liked this video. Let me know what your best and worst of 2025 were. And let's uncover the literary mysteries of 2026 together. See you, Magpies. Bye bye.